Welcome, welcome, welcome. Part of our continuing series where we talk to writers, scholars, reporters, columnists, philosophists, economists, political science professors on political division in America. Is it real? Is it not? How bad is it? Maybe it's not that bad. Maybe it's horrible. What do you think? No agenda reporting. We're trying to reach out to people on the left and the right to make sure that you get informed opinions. And you have to do this thing that I was taught as a high school boy, we're all supposed to do, called think for yourself. Relatively radical concept these days. You may want to look into it, maybe watch some old movies from the 1960s and 70s, but that's what we're intending to do. It's what I was trained as a kid. And I guess I'm a little bit old school that way. With us today is Professor Michael Lee, Professor of Political Communication at the College of Charleston. He's also author of We Are Not One People. Michael J. Lee teaches and writes in the areas of political communication and rhetoric. His research focuses on political branding, political identity, strategic communication, and audience positioning in American politics. His work has earned over a dozen awards, including 5 national book awards for his book, Creating Conservatism, and his latest book, We Are Not One People. He is regularly invited to speak about his research at universities around the country. Okay, those are repeats of the same material. He also wrote this book recently, We Are Not One People, Secession and Separatism in America, Politics Since 1776. It was released last year, so it's very current. E pluribus unum was suggested for the national seal in 1776, but national oneness has been haunted by its opposite ever since. We Are Not One People demonstrates how the persistence of separatist movements in American history reveals as much about the nation's politics as it does the would-be separatists. Each chapter explores how great swaths of Americans of every ideological stripe, in good times and bad, in and beyond the South, have disputed the nation's oneness and stressed its divisibility. Trumpeted in American myths, mottos, movies, songs, separatism is omnipresent in American political culture. Separatist rhetoric has shaped Americans' experiences of what it means to be an American, and we can learn much about the durable appeal and enduring fragility of the United States from those who have tried to leave it. As one Vermont separatist quips, leaving is as American as apple pie. And this is a little bit about what the book was about. The United States has become more polarized over the past decade, with no realistic prospects of reversing the trend. That's from the professor. The degree of polarization and its historical significance can be debated, but the acceptance of it as a fact by voters, media, and politicians animates many of the behaviors, conversations, and concerns about U.S. politics. A 2021 poll by the Center of American Politics at the University of Virginia found that nearly 50% of Trump voters and 40% of Biden voters agreed the nation should be split up. This is reinforced by a prominent member of Congress who called for a national divorce. Federalism scholars are well positioned to provide analysis and perspective on secession and separatism. And that led to this article, written very recently, about a year after the book. Secession is here. States, cities, and the wealthy are withdrawing from America. And this was the quote that got me about that. These are hypothetical scenarios, but not imaginary ones. When groups exit public life and its civic duties and burdens, when they live under their own set of rules, when they do not have to live with fellow citizens they have not chosen or listen to authorities they do not like, they have already seceded. Let's start first. Professor, why did you write the book? Well, first, did I get anything wrong with the introduction or the book or the article or anything about your background?
Absolutely not. You nailed it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We try. Well, let's get right to it. You wrote this book last year. Why? Why write this book last year? Why not write it, 10 years ago? What compelled you to go, boy, I need to get this out last year? What were you seeing as a scholar of politics and also just an American with 2 working eyeballs? What have you been seeing, and why did you feel compelled to write this particular book about this particular subject as recently as last year?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm somewhat, and my co-author as well, is somewhat of a slow writer. So we've been writing the book for going on 7 years. It just came
Okay.
out last year. So we started thinking about the book, frankly, as graduate students at the University of Georgia 20-something years ago. So I remember having conversations about separatism and secession all throughout the American tradition, standing on the campus of the University of Georgia in 2001, 2002, as we were just trying to make our way in the world as early scholars and early graduate students. The book, to your question, though, the book appears at a really fortuitous time in the sense that what's good for readership of the book and interest in this topic is not necessarily good for the country and the nation's oneness. And so what I think the book and this article arrives in a place of extreme hyperpolarization on both sides, in which Americans are more than likely to call each other names than they are to compromise with one another. And a polarized climate that we find it, Americans are really left with three options in terms of finding their way in the political world. One is to eliminate the other side somehow. Two is to compromise with the other side. And three is to get away from the other side. And in many cases, since compromise is off the table, because many of us view our political enemies as enemies and not as just opponents, then getting away from the other side is the easiest political option.
Just a fact. So it sounds like you started writing this book in 2015, about 7 years ago.
Yeah, give or take. I mean, I started doing preliminary research on it with my co-author about a decade ago. We started writing in earnest about 2015, 2016. And then the book came to a head in 2021, late 21, and then it's published in August of 2022. So the speedy wheels of academic publishing can slow down a book. And that's just a normal process.
I just find that interesting because when we were talking before the interview and you're asking, how did I find you? I researched every single study and every single article that has been written in the last 20 years in academia or in the media, and got all the current contact emails, and then emailed about 500 people. What I found was that in 2015, 2012, there was an explosion of research on polarization. And then it went silent until recently now. I have to notice that there seem to be a lot of people talking or interested in political polarization at the academic level during the end of Obama's second term. Any reason for that? Like, why so many people might say, hey, 2015, let's start, because you're not the only one. This is a pattern.
No,
2015
this is very much a
big
pattern.
year for separatism research. Why is that?
I would say that the rise of the Tea Party and intransigence in Congress, the increasing use of the filibuster, increasing use of pretty theatrical politics, whether it's the risking the nation's economic future with the debt ceiling or something along those lines, has really triggered an interest amongst academics in polarization, the way it's changing lives. I would say, too, that we have some pretty decent data on, it's published in a bunch of books on polarization. For instance, Americans are more likely now to object to a son or a daughter marrying somebody from the opposite political party. And those kinds of figures have really spiked in recent years, and academics have taken notice, whereas in the 90s and 80s, and we may think about those as politically contentious times, nevertheless, Americans were relatively okay with kind of cross-party marriages, and now we see increasing evidence of that. Americans are more than likely to live in neighborhoods that are self-segregated based on political ideology, in addition to race, class, demographics, etc. Those are increasing, and so we have this unique kind of moment in 12, 13, up until Trump's election in 16, where I think it felt like canaries in the coal mine, and academics like myself started paying attention to polarization, and then, of course, after Trump's election, it became impossible to miss.
Thank you. Thank you. That's the first time I've been able to ask somebody that. It was kind of a mild observation I had, but that makes a lot of sense. It was at the end of Obama's second term. There was a lot of academics getting involved. And of all of them, I asked this question, and this is the question I have to ask you. Take yourself back to 2015, and you're going, wow, kind of polarized, bad. Kind of never seen it at this level before. It's worth studying. Better now than then, or worse now than compared to then?
I would say polarization is worse now. And I would say, however, that part of the thing that I'm getting to in my book, which is that polarization, secession, and separatism are written into Americans' political DNA, that in some senses the Declaration of Independence is the first real modern secessionist document that we have. And so Americans have always seen exit as a political strategy. and exit is linked to freedom, right? We leave something in order to free ourselves from the very thing that we don't want to be a part of. And so I hesitate to make short-term calculations like secession is much worse now than it was last year or last month or in 2015. That seems plainly obvious to me, but the work that I'm up to in the article and in the book is a much larger historical framework than just the last 5 or 10 years or so.
I agree, and we're gonna zero in on that. I just got to get a couple questions because you're really well informed about this. So I'm only gonna ask this one more time, and I'm not trying to zero down. Could you picture that it was going to be as bad as it is now in 2015? 2015 was pretty bad. Were you thinking, yeah, I bet it can get bad, and I bet there will be a storming of the Capitol, and I bet there'll be a trial of people who are, seen as traitors, and I bet the president will come out and call 48 million Americans basically enemies of the state? Did you see any of that or imagine any of that in 5 years ago, or has it been like, wow, I couldn't imagine it got even more worse?
I would say that I was as surprised as many Americans. And, I had spent the previous decade before writing this book, writing a book about the history of the American right. And that book's called Creating Conservatism, which you mentioned. And so I was coming to this not just as kind of a scholar of political communication and somebody who teaches classes on politics and political campaigns, but somebody who had spent the better part of a decade researching the history of American conservatism. What do conservatives believe? What do they argue with themselves about? What are the periodicals that gave rise to their movement? And so I thought I understood not just American polarization, but also the conservative movement, the kinds of animating ideas that really give rise to their politics. And I would say that I was humbled by the events of the past 5 or 6 years, in addition to being frightened by them.
Humbled and frightened from the events of the last 5 years from a scholar on the topic. We're going to get to the book. I do want to ask you one or two more questions. So I've been doing a lot of interviews with professors and journalists, and they have written about polarization in America. And then they say something like, oh, it's just because of gerrymandering. It's just because of social media. If we fix gerrymandering and we calm down on the social media apps, everything would be fine. Americans would start coming back together, kumbaya. Is that true? Does that make sense to you?
I think there are some bellwether issues that are important in terms of calming the country down. And one of those would be ready access to the ballot for Americans across the political spectrum, making voting easy, making registration easy, giving more people access to the ballot, making districts more competitive. So I understand anybody who says that voting is really the essential democratic challenge of our time and perhaps could have a depolarizing effect. So if the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world are incentivized to say the most radical thing they can think of because they're not in a competitive district, and so the most extreme person in that district is going to win the primary and therefore win the popular vote, there's some real logic to that. Nevertheless, to think that you can pull this or that lever, flip this or that switch, solve this or that issue, and de-escalate from our present crisis is pretty foolish. It's tough to imagine a single scenario that could unravel this.
That's what I was wondering if you were going to say, because you're obviously well informed about some of the facts. There is a big sort. Americans are sorting themselves into ideological communities, whether intentionally or not. That's what seems to be happening. It goes back to the 1990s. It's a 3-decade-long period of increasingly polarized elections. You also mentioned how people will not date each other outside of their politics. That's something we covered, and most people have never heard of that. I've seen 15 different professors, and I go, here's this, where they were going, oh, it's the elites that are polarized. It's the elites. The elites make us polarized. It's not the people. And I go, well, then how come 50% of the average Americans won't date someone outside their political party? Because the elites told them not to, or because they're just as polarized on their own? And it gets real quiet, like tumbleweeds blowing across the wind type quiet. They never saw that before. Then I talk about county elections.
Yeah.
We used to have a chance for Republican or Democrat to have a fighting chance in most of the counties in America in the 90s. The New York Times has covered this. Many other Wall Street journals cover this. Now it's gone to where there's almost no competitive counties at all anywhere in America, and almost every county is a 20% landslide county for red or blue. And I would bring up to these professors, that's not the elites. That's
Mhm.
every single county in America is going this way. Small counties, big counties. That's the people. When you look at the dating, when you look at the counties, it's the people. How come so many professors and
Mm.
reporters and writers who've talked about political polarization in the last year that I've interviewed were completely unaware of the big sort and the data on not dating? And
You
when
know,
I
I would say it's not just.
before you answer,
Go ahead.
I literally showed one of them the landslide voting counties, and he goes like this: "I reject that map."
Mm.
What's going on? How come so many people writing this are completely unaware of the basic facts you are aware of?
You know, I would say some of it is ideological and some of it is aspirational. So there can be an ideological blindness in the sense that certain people will refuse to believe that certain nefarious ideologies can spring up from the bottom as opposed to being imposed by the top. It's an overcommitment to democratic ideals, I imagine. But the second one is aspirational, which is that there's a long history in this country of people saying regular, red blooded, so called normal, typical Americans let bygones be bygones. They believe that they are their brother and their sister's keeper, that they're excellent neighbors. They call each other by their first name and have firm handshakes and the whole nine. And you see this show up not just in professors and journalists, but you see this show up aspirationally in Obama's 2004 Democratic National Convention speech, right? We in the red states have these kinds of friends. We in the blue states have these kinds of friends. There is no culture war. There is no red America. There is no blue America. There is only one America because, as he said, we are one people. And that's exactly the campaign commercials voiced by notable Hollywood actors that Joe Biden went with in his 2020 ads, showing the shining vistas and waves of grain, and voiced by an old actor saying, "We are one people." And so there's a real magic, there's a real majesty to that narrative. So I don't think it's just people putting their heads in the sand, whoever's saying this, and it's hard to respond to since I don't know who they are. But I will say that that's a very attractive fantasy. And it is an aspirational fantasy, and it's one that has a long history in America.
That's beautiful. An attractive fantasy. Because I remember I was so glad you brought it up. You brought up the big sort, you brought up people not dating each other, and you brought
Right.
up people seeing each other as enemies. I remember I think it was the University of Virginia Sabato Crystal Ball Center,
Yeah.
and they were showing 80% of Biden voters and 78% of Trump voters. I might be switching the numbers, but basically
Sure.
80% and 80% said, I see voters as a clear and present danger to America, language we normally reserve for a Russian nuclear missile strike or an ISIL
Mhm.
terrorist attack. Not good.
Mm.
But let's get to the book. What is going on with the book, and what do you mean when you say we've had this division forever, going historically back? What does that mean?
One of the most interesting factoids that I learned when I was researching the book, it actually came pretty late in the process, was that the very troops, in some cases, who had fought and nearly died to defend the Declaration of Independence in the American Revolution, then within 10 or 20 years had to deny the same rights of others who tried to claim it. So upstart communities along Appalachia, like West Sylvania, Transylvania, Franklin, the Whiskey Rebellion outside of Pittsburgh, all of these different communities then spring up citing the Declaration of Independence and then are going to declare their own independence, saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And so you have people who fought and nearly died to defend the Declaration of Independence and their right to secede, then deny others the right to secede. So it is written in our DNA. I mean, the Declaration is our holy document. It is a biblical text in addition to the Constitution as Americans have. And the first two paragraphs are the most careful, the most rhetorically sufficient, the most cogent argument for the conditions under which a national divorce can happen, under which you can say, we are no longer one people. We don't have any sacred bonds with one another anymore. And then throughout the history of the country, obviously with ebbs and flows, we find attempts to secede. One of the things that we were really interested in the book, though, is that I think that we misunderstand secession as Americans because we focus exclusively on the American Revolution and we focus exclusively on the Civil War. One of the things that my co-author and I were trying to do is to talk about secession not as an event, but as a process. And that process includes various types of separatism, including getting away from it all and getting off the grid, including nullification, in which states and localities say no to federal laws, interposition, in which states and localities just suddenly refuse and drag their heels to enforce federal laws, and any and all manner of separatist activities, all the way up to secession. So I think we miss a lot about American politics when we focus exclusively on the fundamental national divorce, because as I say in the book and the article, anybody who's ever been in a relationship knows there's lots of ways to leave the relationship before you actually break up or formally get divorced. It is important to focus on the divorce or the formal breakup, but it's also important to focus on all the things that lead up to that final moment.
Is nullification very close to secession or identical to secession or the step right before secession or the stepchild of secession?
James Madison, when writing about the South Carolina nullification efforts in the 1820s and early 1830s, certainly thought so. He thought that John Calhoun and others who were supporting the South Carolina nullification were, as he said, putting a powder keg to the Constitution and using his ideas for how states could align their interests and protest what they thought were unconstitutional orders. But then if you allowed state-based nullification, it would be the first step and perhaps the last step on the way to secession. Now, Calhoun comes back and says, no, nullification is actually prevents secession, because if you deny states the right to nullify, then their only recourse would be secession. But if you look at it logically extended, right, you begin with a basic kind of refusal where you say, well, we're not going to say no, we're just not going to do that. Sort of like if I ask my daughters to brush their teeth and they just kind of don't for 30 minutes, they've interposed themselves between my idea that they should brush their teeth. If they say, no, we're not brushing our teeth, right, that's fundamental nullification. And then, of course, the last step is we just no longer recognize your authority whatsoever. So you can see the kind of step-by-step process from interposition to nullification all the way to secession.
So when I'm here in California, and in California we had, oh man, you can go back to Obama was president. You can go back to George Bush, and we said, well, we're not going to follow your stem cell regulation for the rest of America. And then Obama was president, and we said, well, we're not going to follow your marijuana regulation.
That's right.
And we're not going to follow your immigration regulation. And then Trump was president, and we had our governor literally go, on Latin American TV in Latin America, consider California as having a separate immigration policy than America.
That's right.
Many California officials were not going to follow federal guidelines on immigration. And then we had COVID, and the governor of California and Oregon and Washington literally wrote a letter together saying we're not going to follow federal orders on COVID. These are all examples of nullification, correct?
Yeah, in most senses, I think nullification really requires the governor or whoever the power that be, that is, say, we do not legitimize whatever the law is within this particular state in an explicit sort of a way. So if the governor of Missouri tomorrow said that no federal gun law can be applied within the state of Missouri, then that would be an example of nullification. Some of these are interpositions. So for instance, it's not as if California was saying, well, marijuana is legal nationally. They were just saying, they were interposing and saying, well, marijuana is legal recreationally and medicinally here. And sanctuary cities might be a closer example to full-on nullification of having a separate foreign policy on Latin American TV.
So when Californians are saying secession, that's crazy talk for racists. We just love telling the federal government that we don't want to follow your immigration, marijuana, COVID, climate change policies. I'm like, what's the difference? Like you're basically acting like people in 1860. I don't like your federal regulations. I don't want to follow them. Californians love saying that all the time. But if you say the word secession, they're like, oh. And I was like, these are almost identical concepts. I get they're different, but these are brothers to each other. And I
That's
see a
right.
lot of liberals not recognize that. They go, no, I didn't say secession. That's
That's
those
right.
crazy Southerners. I said ignore whatever the federal government says and do whatever the hell I please.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big functions of our book was to reconceptualize secession, as I said, not as an event, but as a scale. And the scale includes all the things that you just mentioned. And so what we see after the Civil War, for instance, that Southerners can re-secede as long as they don't call it secession. And so they reinstitute fugitive slave codes, reinstitute all sorts of laws that are antebellum laws, but in the postbellum period. But they get in trouble when they begin calling it secession because they fought a war over that issue. But if you start calling it states' rights, you start calling it home rule, you start calling it federalism, you just call it whatever you want to, state sovereignty, individual sovereignty. There's all sorts of words that really mean this thing. But fundamentally, it's about breaking away from the national order. And it's true on the left and it's true on the right as well. One of the things I try to do in both the book and the article is to remove the idea that somehow secession is just a Southern thing or just a right-wing thing or just a conservative thing or just a white thing or just any other sort of demographic. Nobody has a purchase on it. This is very much right at the center of the American target throughout our history. And California is a good example, but there's plenty of examples on the right and the left.
Yeah, I've heard about some conservative states saying we are a gun sanctuary.
That's right, gun sanctuaries, yeah.
If you're an immigrant sanctuary state, then we get to be a gun sanctuary state. And
that's exactly right.
If you want to tear down what we're doing, you got to tear down what they're doing. And I thought, it's kind of a clever move, because the left has said we have the right to do our own immigration policy just because we feel like it. And then the right said, well, then we have the right to do our own gun policy just because we feel like it. I mean, if you're going to use that legal reasoning, so can we.
That's right.
We're all under the same legal order or organism.
At the end of the day, they're just daring the Justice Department to sue. And when Jeff Sessions was briefly the Attorney General, he said publicly that he was thinking about reinstituting prosecuting states like Colorado and California for being in violation of federal marijuana laws. That never came to pass, but it was certainly possible. That was politically actionable for him had he chosen to do so.
Jeff Sessions came to California and said, you can't secede. Yes. I thought that was impressive that the highest lawmaker in America traveled to California to tell us you can't actually secede.
Yeah.
I thought a lot about the state of America.
From Alabama, yeah. We've found some amazing and deeply ironic instances of this throughout American history while I was researching the book. At one point, a black separatist group had taken root in Mississippi, and we had the then Attorney General of Mississippi, this was in the 1960s, say, at no point does any group have the right to secede from the rest of America, right? And the deepest irony of the Attorney General of Mississippi in the 60s, saying this to a group of black separatists is not lost on hardly anybody.
Okay, let me ask you another question about the book. So you're saying if you go all the way back to 1776, there has been a history of Americans wanting to pull apart, do their own thing. They were really inspired by this secession movement that we call the American Independence Movement. It's technically a secession movement, and that continued. I'm hearing from a lot of people, maybe division's bad, maybe it's really bad, but hey, we had the 1960s and we survived, and we had the 1860s and we survived. Is now worse than 1960, worse than 1860, or not as bad?
Certainly not worse than 1860. I mean, 800,000 or 900,000 dead Americans plus billions of dollars of property damage testifies to that.
1858, right before.
Really the 1850s.
The year before they start shooting.
I think this is the thing that we do in this country, right? Is we look for precedents, and the 1850s and 1960s are the closest thing that we have to today. So whether it's worse or whether it's better, these seem like kind of marginal judgments. There's a good reason why all of our attention is on the 1850s and the 1960s. And it is that these are periods of mass shakeups and mass breakups, and the consequences seem absolutely massive, especially when we consider the 1860s. And so I think we can kind of split hairs and say, well, this is different and that is different. But along some key trend lines, the 1850s start to look increasingly resembling today, similarly with the 1960s. The difference between those periods and this period, and in one way that makes this period worse, and this is theorized in a book by Lillian Mason called Uncivil Wars, a great book on polarization.
Trying to get a hold of her.
Yeah, is that Today, we have a symmetry between mass social movements and political parties. And so in the 1960s, the anti-war movement against Vietnam did not really have a home in the Democratic Party. In fact, that's what the entirety of the Chicago riots were about, was that the people's voices on the street and what was happening inside the halls of the DNC weren't aligned with one another. But increasingly, we find alignment between mass social movements on the right, Trumpism, and of course, pro-Trump politics amongst Republicans, and then the same, to some extent, is true on the left. So that alignment of institutional power and popular sentiment is affectatious in a way that was not true in the 1960s and certainly wasn't true in the 1850s. In some ways, that makes it worse, right? The polarization in the streets can mirror and be exacerbated by polarization in Congress, whereas in the past, those two things would be like two ships passing in the night, not necessarily talking to one another.
That's brilliant. So institutional power and public sentiment are more aligned now than they were in the past. That's pretty good. I have heard from a few people that the 1960s was bad, but there were a couple things that kept everybody together. Number one, people were divided on women's rights and Vietnam, but they lived in the same families. So you didn't say, hey, I feel this way about Vietnam, I'm against it. I'm going to move to a totally separate state. I'm against Vietnam. They were kind of in the same families, and you might have debates within the same families, but they were still in the same household. The other thing we heard was faith in institutions. Hey, I don't like you. You're a conservative. You're a liberal. I still believe that when the president wins an election, he won it. I still believe the Supreme Court, when they make a law, we all have to follow it. And what I'm hearing today is we don't have common faith in institutions almost at any level, anywhere except for the military. And we have people who are literally pulling themselves out of their family unit and going far away from them. And that's markedly different from the 1960s. Your thoughts, opinions?
I would have to see data on the family argument. I'm not sure about that one. I will say that trust in institutions since the 70s, as you well know, since Watergate and Vietnam, is way down across the board, including churches, the presidency, Congress, of course, the Supreme Court, which is in the news as we speak, all the way down, which exacerbates the extent to which Americans will put their faith in something greater than themselves. And so that is certainly different than the 1960s. I would say, though, that it really depends on where you look, right? Because in the South, after Brown versus the Board of Education, the idea that Southerners, or certainly Southern power brokers in states like where I live now in South Carolina, had a lot of faith in the Supreme Court after Brown versus the Board of Education, the Cooper versus Aaron, and these anti-nullification cases, was certainly not the case, right? Nullification was, especially on the issue of segregation, was prominent and possible in 11 states of the former Confederacy. And so, yes, we can talk about these kind of national norms that you mentioned, but really when we get specific about issues like, let's say, Southern intransigence on desegregating schools, we don't find a lot of faith in that institution. We don't find a lot of national commonality.
Fair enough. But we had generally, from what I've looked at some surveys, and it seems like we have the lowest faith in Congress, lowest faith in the presidency, lowest faith in the Senate, lowest faith in almost every regulatory body in the last 40 years. Going back, to the 60s. And so when you were in the 60s, you could be a radical leftist, you could be a hardcore veteran who just got back from Vietnam and believed in it. I don't think either one of those guys was saying, that last election, I don't think your guy actually won. I doubt the whole election. I doubt him winning. Oh yeah, my election? I doubt your guy won. And I doubt none of that happened then at that time. They're like, I may not like this guy, but they won, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's some good work on this issue, especially as we focus on the right. So for instance, it's among the most famous essays in the history of American politics is called The Paranoid Style by Richard Hofstadter. And it's written in the 1960s, and he's interested in the extent to which fantasies and conspiracy theories have taken over the conservative right wing. And he's really responding to the John Birch Society and people who thought that Eisenhower was a secret communist and elections were being rigged by the Soviets. And so the kind of basic factuality that you're talking about, we can find some pretty prominent examples of people disagreeing on the basic facts. Have the Soviets overrun the State Department? Is there the fluoride in our water being placed there by the Soviets for mind control purposes? There's a prominent section of folks who are worried about these things, thinking about these things, writing tons of pamphlets and books about these things in the 50s and the 1960s. And it really sets the right apart. And so we have right-thinking figures like Russell Kirk thinking, Eisenhower is not communist, he's a golfer, and he was criticizing Eisenhower for a whole different set of reasons. So I get your point, but I would say that the closer you look, the more you can find examples of these kinds of things in American history.
But would they be on the same scale? My understanding was the John Birch Society was
Difficult.
relatively fringe. We're talking about MAGA being half of America and being
Yeah,
called by the American president an existential threat. The scale has to be much larger. You would agree?
absolutely. Yes, absolutely. There's some new good work on the power that the John Birch Society did have, but to say it rose to the level of a nominee for the presidency or a sitting president is beyond, totally beyond.
Let's go to the article.
Mm-hmm.
Secession is here. States, cities, and the wealthy are already withdrawing from America. You wrote that very recently in Salon. And this is the quote that got me. When people are not living with each other, when they're moving away, when they don't follow the same authorities, they have already seceded. What is this article about? What is your major argument you're making in this article, Professor?
The major argument is one I've already said a bit about, which is that let's not focus on the final event of secession and where we draw up articles of secession and plant a new flag somewhere else, and let's focus on these mini acts, secession-like, de facto secession, what we might call a softer kind of secession. So it was on my mind just a month or so ago when I was doing my taxes. It came to mind to me that there are people in this country who are able to pay a much less tax rate than I am, and they can do so pretty easily, and they can do so because they can afford to do so, and they can do so because they understand the system and how to game it better than I do, and they have access to levers of power that I do not. And so in some cases on that issue of taxes, we're living in two different societies, one in which we're all accountable and one in which some of us are accountable, right? And if some people who had the means to escape, let's say, an audit by the IRS, or have the means to park money in an offshore account or some other tax haven, places that most of us do not, then they're operating by a completely different set of tax rules. And that's just one way, one example on one issue in which groups of people are seceding or softly seceding from American public life. Other issues are schools. Different districts in the schools and school districts around the country are inventing new school districts so their kids don't have to go to existing schools. In many cases, and it's not just in the South, although it's prominently in the South, these are white, wealthy, new school districts who are seceding in acts of school secession from more diverse cosmopolitan schools.
I was just told about an essay that Robert Reich wrote in the 1990s.
That's right.
For New York Times, I think, where he talked about secession of the successful. The wealthy were basically being entitled to all sorts of goodies that the rest of us can't get, and they were basically being segregated into a separate class. He was saying that in the 1990s. Sounds like you guys might be somewhat aligned on the thought.
Very much so, and that was among the first pieces I read when I was really researching the long-term importance of secession in American public life. And in the book, and what I try to do in the article as well, is to draw from lots of different case studies and lots of different examples, but also lots of different walks of life. And so the book, I focus on different chapters on Black nationalists and lesbian communes and libertarians, the wealthy, and of course, the Confederacy, and Latter-day Saints and Mormons movement out west. And so I tried to find as many different examples in religion and race, on gender, on issues of economics, on issues of regionality and state-based rights I could find to show just how American this is. This is so widespread. And the article is really just that in a microcosm, that in miniature, states, cities, and the wealthy. States on issues like drugs, on issues like sanctuary cities, on issues like guns, and so forth. And then, of course, the wealthy, as we're just talking about right now.
Let's get into the meat and potatoes. What is soft secession? What is mini secession? What are examples that you're talking about that cities, states, and the wealthy are doing? What actions are they taking, do you mean?
The taxes is a great example. Getting out of paying your taxes seems like it's as old as apple pie, but there's some really elaborate ways to do it, including offshoring accounts, but there's also more public ways to do it. And so this fight that Ron DeSantis is having with Disney, of course, the politics of it and his bid for the presidency are interesting, and who's going to win is an interesting story. But one of the things that's bringing to light is that Disney is a special tax district. Disney grants its own permits. Disney oversees its own operation. Disney is fundamentally distinct from every other town and every other builder in the rest of Florida, who have to go through a set of normal rules and regulations that Disney does not. And that's just one special tax district. And there are over 18,000 special tax districts throughout the United States. And so this is one example. We live with these all the time. In some ways, they've just become normal, right? Like people talking about dodging the draft. That is an small act of secession in the 1960s that you just mentioned, in the same way that getting out of jury duty or getting out of a speeding ticket or not paying a particular fine or offshoring your money in an offshore account. All these are little acts of soft secession, mini secession, de facto secession, call it whatever you want to.
I remember when I learned that the NFL doesn't pay taxes.
Yeah, that's a great example. That's a great example. Churches don't pay taxes.
Church or football. What would be an example of a state withdrawing from America?
Well, there's lots of different ways that they could do it, and we've talked about a few thus far. And one is on guns, one is on immigration. All of the states who are not abiding by federal law in terms of marijuana, in some ways, have interposed themselves between federal law and what happens in the borders of their states. But there are many other examples as well. So, for instance, lots of states refused. For instance, when Obamacare was brand new and states would enter the exchange to create markets for new insurance. For Americans, states refused that as an example of interposition, and some even threatened secession over the issue. A national petition circulated that got over several 100,000 signatures over the issue of compulsory signing up for Obamacare at the state level. So it could really go lots of different ways, whether it's guns, whether it's, frankly, the issue of abortion could make it even more prominent too, as we start talking about Supreme Court cases that might be heard over whether you can advertise about abortion services and abortion care across state lines. Can you travel? Can you aid or abet somebody in seeking abortion care across state lines? The more radical the Supreme Court is on nationalizing this issue, the more we're going to find more and more secessionist movements. And right now we're already finding prosecutors and judges who are in red states where abortion care is newly illegal saying they're not going to enforce that law, or they're not going to seek out people to charge if they have sought abortion care. And those are acts of interposition.
Right, within their own state. Excellent.
That's right.
Excellent. State to the feds, and then someone within the state. Yeah, it doesn't stop. Just like you said, the original Americans, after they seceded from England, they were like, well, maybe we start seceding from each other. You start an idea. It reminds me, there was an old adage in medieval times. You cannot kill a rival king, or people will understand that you can kill a king.
Right. It becomes thinkable, right?
Exactly. They wouldn't kill rival kings, you banish them. And the reason is people get the idea, oh my God, this a king can be killed. So they wouldn't do it. They were like, and this went in Asia, this was some large understanding. And you're like, why don't they kill their arch rivals? Because they're afraid of their own life being taken.
That's right. That's a good line.
I'm a history buff. I didn't invent that. That was an old line. It was in an Asian movie, history movie or something. There was some movie in Indonesia where they had to kill the king, and so they were going to break this law. So the way that they did it was they had this priest bless a bag, and they put the king in the bag, and then they had an elephant stomp on the bag so that you couldn't say any human actually touched this king and had anything to do with the king's death. And they had to go this elaborate ritual to execute a guy, just to keep that mythos intact.
Right. The powerful symbol of the monarchy.
Yeah, no, it was, and this was why this was the way it was in China, Southeast Asia, Arabia, the Middle East for like hundreds of thousands of years. Anyways, is soft secession increasing? You're studying going back to the 1776. You're pointing out that there's interest in Americans separating, going all the way back. Sure, that's a background noise.
Sure.
Is it increasing, or it's not increasing? This is just, normal level it's always been.
Anecdotally, it seems like there are periods in American history, especially on core issues, whether it's abortion now, maybe it was the politics of enslavement in the 1820s and 1830s, when we found similar efforts of creative acts of nullification, creative acts of interposition, even northern states then engaging in creative acts of giving formerly enslaved people fair trials, right, which is illegal in many states of the Union. So we find places where there's a rapid increase in many acts of secession on specific bellwether issues, abortion, enslavement, etc. And so along those lines, difficult to measure, but along those lines, it seems like now it absolutely mirrors some of those hotbed periods in time, some of those powder keg periods in time when it feels like the country is coming apart, polarization is increasing, and as polarization increases, one of the evidence of and causes and accelerants of polarization are acts of separatism, acts of secession. Because essentially you're denying yourself democratic accountability, and you're also denying your membership in a cosmopolitan federal republic in which we all live. And so to the extent that you can live by your own set of rules, thumbs your nose at those who have to live by those rules.
Would it be fair to say that soft secession, these acts of mini accession, at least appear to be occurring more frequently than in the last 3 decades?
It certainly seems that way to me.
Okay.
Having looked at this issue for quite some time now,
and I get it.
That way to me.
Got to be specific. Got to stick to the data. And that all of you professors are great. Going, I can't really answer that question. I can answer this question, but I can't. You got to frame, or you have to re-ask it. I'm like, I get it. I get it.
I hear you.
We want informed conversations. We don't want you just going, I feel, yeah.
That's right. Shooting from the hip over here.
Yeah, because we'll have writers and activists on, and they'll shoot from the hip, and that's what I expect from them. Is they're like, I'm on the ground. I don't really study this. I just have a lived experience, and that's a different interview, and that's fine for them to shoot from the hip. I'm not asking them for their opinion. I'm asking them what they saw, and we try to get a comparison. But with you guys who study this, it's a very different form of questioning. Let me ask you, if I may, how bad is it going to get? Some people said, we're worried about civil war. Is that ridiculous? It's not going to get worse than it is now. It'll calm down next year. Come on, guys. These things peter out every couple of years. Don't worry. It'll be fine. It'll work itself out. Or we don't actually know if it's going to calm down.
Yeah. On a scale of everything's going to be fine to everything's going to be disastrous, somewhere in the middle, trending towards disastrous. I can imagine lots of scenarios, and David French actually wrote a decent book about secession, imagining some of these scenarios in which the first domino would fall. Maybe it's California nullifying a Supreme Court decision on abortion, for instance, and so the fifth largest economy in the world decides that it no longer wants to be part of America. And then what happens, right? And you can imagine a world in which federal troops are involved. You can imagine a world in which the National Guard is involved, the economic ramifications, the human toll that would take, and how long that would go on before it would become pacified. It's really difficult to imagine. And I would just stress that one of the things I wrote the book, my co-author and I wrote the book to say was not that secession is so normal and so everybody should just get used to it, but in a sense to say that we have this written in our DNA, and so it is indeed possible. And so anybody who thinks that secession is just kind of a bluff, or secession is just kind of like a prank phone call, or secession is just a way to negotiate with hostage takers who say, well, we're not going to participate, but you need us in the Union, I think is missing the boat a little bit. Secession is very thinkable, and it's becoming more thinkable. And it's happening in smaller ways and more clever and clandestine ways, but it could become more and more possible down the road. And so I would hate to be somebody looking back who had a kind of failure of a tragic imagination and just couldn't see this thing coming.
Whew, you are full of sound bites. Failure of a tragic imagination, in the middle, trending towards disaster. The first and last step. No, yeah. We've had division. Oh, okay. You're good at this. Some people have said, Marjorie Taylor Greene, you're calling for national divorce. You're silly.
Yeah.
We don't need national divorce. We need marriage counseling. There was a Utah governor who said we need marriage counseling. This was picked up by everybody on the left, everybody on the right, widely reprinted, and yet never defined. So everybody repeated that. Oh, yeah, that's the right solution. And yet they never said what that looks like. What does marriage counseling that's effective look like for a population of 300 million Americans who are as polarized as we have been since the 1960s?
I just saw snippets of that story, the marriage counseling story. I saw a lot about the national divorce story, and I never saw much in the way of a clear definition, but I'm willing to speculate. I teach some classes on argumentation, I teach some classes on political campaigns, and I
Sure.
often talk with students about this very issue, which is, what does depolarized rhetoric look like? What
Thank
does
you.
de-escalatory rhetoric look like? So I'm willing to entertain the question about what this marriage counseling metaphor might look like. And I mean, I think it starts with engagement of the other side. I think it starts with seeing the other side through more humorous terms and less tragic terms. In other words, the other side didn't necessarily wake up in the morning trying to be as evil as possible. Certainly, there's nefarious actors in the world, but at the same time, all of us are capable of some pretty wicked acts, depending on the context. And so, seeing all of ourselves as flawed human beings capable of great good and great bad at the same time, and then engaging people on where they live, right? There's an amazing set of stories about the activist and pianist Daryl Davis, who personally convinced over 200 members of the Ku Klux Klan to give up their robes, and
I saw that.
him, a black man, able to engage in these acts of persuasion. And what I found from researching his case on de-escalatory rhetoric, and there's a series of great books and podcasts about how he did that and the jeopardy he put himself in those acts of persuasion, right, is that persuasion is often personal. It is often relational, right? It's difficult to stream one podcast, to show one documentary, and have a kind of changing of the mind and bring somebody back from the conspiratorial brink. It happens in conversation, it happens in dialogue, and it happens like this. As you build trust with somebody, it becomes difficult to deny that person's basic humanity, and then the way that person sees the world becomes more and more palatable, and all of a sudden we can engage in a polite political dialogue more so than we can over, let's say, social media.
The man that you mentioned, though, is seen as an expert in communication. People are wowed at what he does. It's not seen as easy or average. It's spectacular.
It is.
How do we get 200 million Americans to be as qualified as that man?
Well, to my knowledge, he had no special training. He's an ordinary human being like the rest of us. And there's many other examples. We can focus on Daryl Davis, but there's many other examples as well of people being brought back from the brink through their relationships with loving, understanding individuals. And so your question is about numbers, though, and I have not the slightest idea how you get 300 million Americans to do this same thing. But the numbers of us who need that kind of de-escalation is certainly not 300 million, but it's larger than both of us would like.
Fair. When I hear the answer of marriage counseling is the solution, it seems like they're talking about someone's going to show us the way. Who would be the marriage counselor for America? Who is the person that both the left and the right would listen to and could model the behavior you're saying, and people would go, you know what? I had it wrong. I'm inspired by this leader. I need to do. Who is that person?
I think that's where I was trying to emphasize the importance of personal relationships, because we live in a society where polarization has taken over our media. And so let's say an actor stepped forward and that person's mantle was de-escalating American political tensions, and that person was Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, or
Right.
Tom Hanks, or Scarlett Johansson, or anybody, right? That person, depending on the left or the right, immediately gets pigeonholed as a representative of this or that partisan interest group. If it's the president, that person's already pigeonholed. If it's from the pulpit, that person's already pigeonholed. And so the power of these labels makes it such that a mediated personality, somebody who has a pre-existing reputation, is going to be very difficult to beam into somebody's living room and have them be personally successful. That's why I think it has to be the kind of anonymous folks, the Daryl Davises of the world, all of us doing this work in our own real lives, our own personal lives, at the ground level. It's almost, we have to build this from the bottom up. I don't think this can be imposed during a presidential election or a political campaign or a Sermon on the Mount type speech.
So it's up to the American people to fix the American people, and they're
I
going to have
do think
to
so.
individually.
That's what I think.
Okay. Some people have also said federalism is the answer to all of our woes. We just need to start returning more power to the states, and everything will get a lot less stressed.
Yeah.
Is that true? Is that false?
Well, I mean, the line between federalism and nullification and interposition to me is a blurry and murky one at its very best. And so, as a matter of fact, I think that we actually live in a world in which federalism, by some definitions, is increasing quite widely. All the examples we've given of nullification and interposition are examples of federalism, maybe an aggressive, overweening federalism. And so that sense of national identity that many people crave, the sense of American oneness, the idea that we are one people, is difficult to achieve by 50 different nations masquerading all as Americans at the same time. Right? That is the real tension of freedom and unity. Right? We are free to be one another. We are free to be South Carolinians and Californians, but at the same time, we're trying to be unified as Americans. And sometimes, especially in periods like this one, the 1960s and the 1850s, that tension between freedom and unity becomes quite obvious.
That's a fascinating point. So with more federalism becomes less common American identity. There's less universal thing on all of us. That's interesting.
And that's people engaged in this big sort that you mentioned earlier. You know, it's possible to move, let's say, a state like Indiana and cross the border into Illinois and enter what is fundamentally a different country, right? They might speak the same language, they may look the same or have the same accent, they might have some similar churches and roads and such, but at the same time, on abortion, on guns, on marijuana, on immigration, on taxes, on schooling, on all sorts of issues that define our basic public lives and coexistence, you could be entering a fundamentally different country. Now, the idea that that's good for national identity is an argument that's difficult to find persuasive evidence for.
That's a great point. I haven't heard that anywhere else. Do you think that abortion could become the new dividing issue like slavery was in the 1860s?
There's real work being done on this, and I do.
Yeah.
I think depending on what the Supreme Court does and the way that local judges and state level Supreme Courts begin to police this issue could make it absolutely explosive on the level of fugitive enslavement was in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And so the issues that gave rise to Dred Scott were about pro slave owning interests trying to nationalize their position. There's this kind of great myth that the South was on the side of small government and the North was on the side of big government. And so conservatives have kind of wrapped the Southern lost cause case in the idea that this big overweening federal government came and crushed the little guys in the South. But in fact, it's completely flipped, right? Abraham Lincoln speaking in 1858 and then again in 1860 said, you know, you might wake up in a free state and go to bed, and then because of a Supreme Court case like Dred Scott or yet another Dred Scott case that was going to come down the pike called the Lemon case, you might wake up and find that your state is now an enslavement state as well. And the reverse could happen, right? States like California and many others that provide abortion care, you could wake up and because of a Supreme Court case, it could be quite the opposite. And so then real political decisions would have to be made, in addition to personal, human, and tragic decisions.
I was in Sacramento the day after the 2016 election when it was announced that Trump won. People were shocked. They and our legislature, the entire legislature of California issued a statement saying we feel like we woke up in a foreign country today. They actually said that.
Right.
So, we're winding down. Any comments or websites or questions you have for us or statements you'd like to cover, or is there something you wanted to talk about related to these issues?
I really appreciate the time. It's an honor to be featured on the program. And if anybody's curious about the book, it's called We Are Not One People. And then my first book about the right is called Creating Conservatism. And I really appreciate your time today.
Before you go, I hope you found that this was fair, not gotcha journalism. We didn't try to put words in your mouth, etc. Is there anyone you could recommend? Anyone you know who might be willing to be part of an honest conversation? Left, right, professional, non-professional?
Dozens.
I'll email you.
Yeah, I'm happy to email about this issue and give you some
Thank you.
resources on this. Yeah.
Thank you. This is how we're able to keep it going. I will
Okay.
send you a copy of the video. If you could tell me whatever recommendations you have, I'd deeply appreciate it.
Happy to help.
Okay. We'll leave it there. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and we will see you very soon. Professor, I will email you within the hour.
Please do.